You're listening to the Wordslinger Podcast, episode 012, interview with indie author Jamie Maltman. This episode of the Wordslinger Podcast is brought to you by The Lucid, episode 1, written by me and author Nick Thacker, available right now on Amazon, or you can check it out on my website, kevintumlinson.com/books.
It's the Wordslinger Podcast, where story matters. Build your brand, write your book, redefine who you are. It's all about the story here. What's yours? Now, here's the guy who invented pants optional, Kevin Tumlinson, the Wordslinger.
Wordslinger.
Hi everybody, this is Kevin Tumlinson and I am the Wordslinger, and I am here, pants optional and all. I'm just going to let you dwell on that one for a bit. How's everybody doing? I'm asking you as if you're going to answer, because I feel you are. I feel you're there out in your cars or on your treadmills or your bicycles or whatever, and you're answering me right now. So, hi. So this week, many of you've got to know by now. I mean, if you listen to the show at all, you have to know that I am I'm part of a special group, and that group is the indie author crowd. And we indie authors, we spend a lot of time doing all sorts of crazy things that you just normal people don't do. And those things include fun stuff, like, sitting in a cafe or Starbucks or something and pecking away at a story. But it also includes some more difficult stuff, like, building marketing funnels and trying to figure out how to get our work out in front of a ever-increasing audience and how to make a living off this stuff. And so, there's the fun side of being an author, which is mostly the storytelling and hobnobbing with some fans and that sort of thing. But it can be a lot of work. So, one thing that happens, and an interesting part of this particular industry, is that a lot of indie authors tend to band together, and we end up sort of being a support group for each other. So, and we also like to share what we've learned with everybody. So if there's ever a tip or trick or hack or skill that, one of us learns that we think could help everybody, we'll be right out there with it. And that's great. I mean, I love that kind of community. That sort of thing has cropped up quite a bit with the group of people that I ended up sort of coming into contact with through the Fiction Unboxed series that was done by the self-publishing podcast guys. And they had, they spent their 30 days writing a novel live for everybody to see, and that was awesome. And, it was cool. I liked watching it. I don't think I participated on the level that some people did, which is kind of unfortunate. They're doing it again right now, so maybe I'd give another chance. But one thing that did come out of that I'm really happy about is I met tons of authors who were just like me. Guys who are out there, they got a love for story. They want to pull it all together. They want to tell their tales, and they want that work to do well. And they're willing to kind of, roll their sleeves up and get their hands dirty and really dig in. And that it's refreshing to meet that group because before, anytime I did like a writer's group or whatever, it's pandering. I mean, it's just people really just trying to get you to read their work. So it just wasn't, it never did click with me. I never did resonate with that group. But these guys formed a Google Plus group called Unboxers of Fiction. And through that group, I've met some outstanding people, brilliant, excellent writers, all of them looking to crack the code, as it were, and do the same sorts of things that I'm doing, that all of us dream about. So we want to become the next Hugh Howey or Amanda Hawking and those superstars of the self-publishing world. So in all that, now a couple of weeks ago, you heard from one of those unboxers, which was Michael Laron, who is the author of several fantasy stories and the Decision Select novels and that sort of thing. This week, I'm talking to Jamie Maltman, who he's written. Now we've had some trouble sort of categorizing, because on the one hand, what he's written is a sort of historic fiction, but it's not like a literal history. It's a fictional history, but it has that tone. And so, and when I read it, I was I was intrigued by that. And it's not what I would call epic fantasy. It's not that sort of story, but it has some of those elements as well. So it's very good. I mean, it's an interesting read. It's engrossing. I read Brush with Darkness. I need to pick up the rest of the next book in that. And he's continuing to produce books. So I think we're going to see a lot from Jamie, actually. So I'm not going to keep you up anymore. I'm going to let Jamie talk now. But this is Jamie Maltman, and he is discussing his work. And I'll give you some links and stuff at the end. So enjoy. Well, hi everybody. I'm here with Jamie Maltman, who is the author of the Arts Reborn series, which I read the first one. I need to catch up, man. I feel bad. I'm a bad host. I haven't read Beyond Brush with Darkness, but great books, man. So I just want to welcome Jamie Maltman to the show. How you doing, Jamie?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no problem, anytime. And we had a little bit of discussion before I started rolling here, and I'm so excited about the idea that I want to talk about it before I forget to bring it up. So, this podcast is all about story, and we're definitely going to look at your work. But you brought up an interesting topic in the idea of story as it relates to history. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Absolutely. Well, really, I don't know. It's funny. Some people, you mention the word history, and they think of school, and they think of having to memorize dates and facts and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know whether I was just introduced to historical fiction or introduced to how, all history is a story. And, there's those famous quotes of like, it's the story written by the winners and that side of things. And I just find it so fascinating. Like every one of those facts is really connected to a story about something that happened at some point. And whether it's the people or whether it's discoveries or whether it's exploration or, wars or anything is really all some kind of a story. And so when for anyone that doesn't enjoy history or thinks it's boring because of school, like if you could find the right historical fiction or even just sort of narrative nonfiction, but related to history, just bringing those stories out to connect people to it so they can learn from it or enjoy it or just, be fascinated by everything there. I just think that's an absolutely fascinating topic. And I love to read sort of anything in those veins as well.
How does so in your Arts Reborn series, how does history factor in to those stories?
Well, I've loved. There's a lot of I'm in love with a whole bunch of different periods in history that I love to explore in different ways. One particular one that came out of a combination of historical fiction reading and taking a bit of Latin in high school when my school still had it. Was the Roman period and Greek period as well, and how that touched into art as well. So there's fascinating stories in there. There's the ones that get woven into myth, or where myth crosses over into reality, or in some way, like the founding of Rome, or going deeper into the sort of mythical history of Greece that was written down in some of these great stories in those days. So I'd always wanted to set something there. And I had some other ideas myself of things that I'd like to explore. Some are sort of specific things that I've found through reading about history or reading other historical fiction. Like one of my favorites set in that period is Colleen McCullough's Founders of Rome series.
Oh, yeah.
That starts with The First Man of Rome. I absolutely love it. It's funny because she's most known for The Thornbirds is her big novel. But
right.
I don't know whether it was her first novel, but it's one that I started reading.
That's her most notable.
Yeah, it's the one that's like author of Thornbirds is what would always show up in her tag. And I read it and it's really interesting, but it just didn't grab me the same way because it's not that same kind of period. Like that's sort of going through following people in Australia, I think it was around the turn of the century or turn of previous century. But her Rome series just brought the characters to life as well as there's just so much historical detail there about how the Republic, because people always think of Rome as the empire, but that was the Republic period. And I find that idea so fascinating of in, 500 BC right up till the time of Caesar, this place that had developed this system, this republic, where you have people elected every year from this sort of group, and there's just all these dynamics of the politics and the economic stuff that factors into that, and just she brought so much of that to life, and how that changed and how the republic changed. That I've always wanted to play with some of those ideas, so that was all rolling around in the back of my head, as well as some of my art background, which gets more into the Greece side, and then some ideas I had about magic, and that sort of started to come together in the story that I wanted to tell. And it was neat too, because it was not just a fusion of those things, but even a few ideas I had myself. It's actually a story I was telling my son when he was 2 or 3. It just had to do with some of this art as magic idea, but sort of a present day, just off the top of my head little story. And as I got into that, I don't know, I think I just repeated it to my wife, and then I had this aha moment where some of the setting stuff all came together, and this story just started to appear and write itself in the way that I think it was sort of meant to be right, in air quotes, but it meant to be written. Well, and it's been a lot of fun, and I'm enjoying where it's taking me.
So I've had that experience. I mean, it seems like the whole thing's just flowing right out of you. I mean, what did you have trouble when you sat down finally to write? Well, first of all, what made you decide that writing books was something you wanted to do?
I was an early reader. My mother was reading fantasy to me when I was a kid, and so I really got into reading and loving it. And whether it was Narnia or Tolkien, as a pretty small child, and so I started writing down stories when I was very young. And I like to draw too, so I would write and illustrate my little stories. And I have this little book my mom's got that's laminated from when I was, I think, in grade 2. Where I don't know, something about dragons and some fire mountain or something, with all my little illustrations, and I typed it out on the old. I think she had an electronic typewriter by then. So I loved writing, and I used to twist whenever my English classes in middle school or high school. I would take the loosest interpretation of whatever they were assigning me to make it into a creative writing project. Yeah. So absolutely whenever possible, and I was very much into sort of role playing games and games kind of stuff in those years. So I was writing a lot of D&D tie-in kind of stuff for those. So I have no idea. My high school English teachers probably thought I was nuts, other than one who liked sci-fi and fantasy rather than just sort of stuff set in Victorian England, and not steampunk Victorian England, because that would have been a lot more fun. But she really encouraged it, and we had I don't know, back then here, and I live in Ontario, Canada, we had a grade 13 that one of the courses you could take was writer's craft, and she taught that, and that was just a blast. She got us writing. I think we wrote something once, and then we had to write it again as the screenplay version, and we had to write it again working in poetry or different things. So it was all different forms of creative writing as well. So absolutely had a blast with that. I actually started a novel back then that had some sort of time travel-y, flashback, past life kind of stuff involved in it. And I actually painted a picture that was intended to be in my art class. I would go cross-discipline. So for my art class, I painted what would be the cover illustration for that story as well. So that's something I never finished it. Then I went on to university and still studied the history side. And one of my majors was East Asian Studies, Asia Pacific Studies. So that's when I really got into Asian history and culture and language. And I did computer science, and that's what I ended up working in. And so I got away from writing for the longest time. But what got me back into it recently was, funny enough, it was when my first son was born. He's 5.5 now. We would go to. I wanted to get books because my mom took us to the library every week or twice a week when I was a kid. Yeah. And I remember just being surrounded by books all the time. And so I started looking at books, and some people were buying us books. But I looked at how expensive the kids' books were, and I was like, I'm going to go broke if I'm buying all these single read books from my kids. Now, that's assuming that they, most of them will be single use, and the ones that aren't are the ones you're going to want to burn because you've read them 500 times.
Right, yeah.
So I started taking him to the story time at the library, started getting out books for him, and while I was there one time, I walked over into I can't even remember how I got there, but I got into the sort of the section on writing. And I think I may have even picked up Stephen King's On Writing at the time. And I'd been toying with the idea of writing again. There's actually another one that influenced me was David and Lee Eddings wrote a book about their world, about the Belgariad world.
Yeah.
But I can't remember the name of the book. But in the back of that book, they had this section about what it was like creating that world and being a writer, and just sort of went off on a tangent. And I found that book in the library on a cruise ship once.
Yeah.
And that had been like in the back of my head for a few years by that point. But then I started reading some writing books and saying, you know what, why am I not doing this? And why am I not writing these stories down? And I want to tell stories to my son, and I want to, tell these stories that are inside of me. So why not play with it a bit? And so for a couple of years there, I was just sort of doing a little bit when I could. I was very busy, and he was young, and we had a business going on and all sorts of things. And then it was we had a writer in residence at my local library, who's a local published author by the name of Richard Scarsbrook. And they had some free writing courses that he was going to be running. So I said, well, why not? They're free, and it's at my local library, so I don't have to drive very far. So sat in on those, and that just woke me back up again and really pushed through. And he sat down with me, and I had like my first couple of chapters, and he sat down and did sort of a critique of that with me and gave me some ideas and complimented me on what was there, saying, it's a lot closer than most of what he sees to being something that I could actually do something with. And that's when things flew from there. And I'm like, okay, I'm doing this for real. He was still traditional side of saying, this is, well, you wouldn't self-publish because it's vanity publishing kind of thing. So here's the, whatever, writer's market. You should go and read this kind of stuff and understand how the industry works. And a couple of months later was when I accidentally went from like someone focusing on that sort of thing podcast to the self-publishing podcast, and went, oh, wait, technology is letting this happen. And that's when things really went into high gear. So
the name of that book, by the way, was Riven Codex.
That's right. Yeah.
I was a huge fan of the Belgariad. Yeah, and
Belgariad. I don't know how it's said.
Yeah. I don't know either. I've always pronounced it Belgariad, I think, but that doesn't make it right. So, okay, so you came around at some point. You discovered a self-publishing podcast, the self-publishing podcast, or a different one.
The self-publishing podcast, yeah.
Which is the same thing that happened to me. Really, because I'd already published when I came across that podcast. That was at the point when I decided I would take this seriously and do it as a business. But so you've discovered all this. What really won you over with the self-publishing idea? I mean, did you pursue trying to get traditionally published at all?
The furthest I went with that was, so I'd written, I think, about 40%. Actually, no. Okay, I'd written about 20,000 words in my novel. Then in NaNoWriMo of 2011 or 12, it's all blending together now. That's when I wrote another like 20, in NaNoWriMo I wrote 20,000 words more on that existing one. Yeah. And that's around the time that I showed it to this guy, Richard Scarsbrook. So I stepped away, but then I started to bog down because that first novel, especially writing in Word, that hit 30,000 words, it starts to get so unwieldy in that one document. And one of the things from reading that writer's market stuff was they were saying, well, then there's short stories, and you need to build that portfolio of stuff to build up your reputation, blah, 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 all that, the traditional way of looking at it.
Right.
And my University of Toronto, had a significant contest each year for a piece of short fiction. So I said, well, why don't I take one of the minor characters there and write a little backstory short story about her. So that was the first thing that I ever submitted to any kind of contest or anything. Was that. I didn't win, but just the process of preparing that, doing all that stuff to move forward, to try and do it that way, and read about all these things, was sort of the only foray that I made in that direction whatsoever. And then I read the winners, and of course it's not genre fiction, it's very more literary or some emotional thing, sort of thing. Although mine does have some of those elements, even in that short story, to some extent. And so I think it was, I can't remember what it was. I was listening to Ian Broom's podcast, the Write for Your Life podcast. Mm-hmm. At that point, that was the one where he had a more traditional focus. And I don't know whether I ran out of episodes, like I caught up to date, and I was like, well, let's look for another publishing podcast, or not publishing podcast, but like writing podcast. And it was like April of that year. So that was last year, right? So 2013. So April 2013. That's when I came across the self-publishing podcast. And I think while I was doing, because I do some IT consulting work, and I can listen to podcasts while I'm doing that from home. And I think I listened to, they started like September or something the previous year, or August. I listened to the August to April over the course of the next month or so. Mm-hmm. And it was seeing Johnny's mindset change and what he started to do from zero, or from one book that he'd written a long time ago, through Fat Vampire, through the collaboration that started with Unicorn Western, all that stuff, in that compressed period of time, that made me say, wow, like, why, there's absolutely no reason I can't be doing this.
Right. Yeah.
It was that proof of concept, and it was neat how, they never intended it to be like that. They were just sort of doing it on the fly. But to me, as someone with an interest in writing, seeing that process there was that neat proof of concept for me, for the business side of my mind, as well as, what you can do with the creative side.
Well, and to me that's what was interesting, because like I said, I had published, I had done the work. I just wasn't seeing sales and wasn't really thinking of it in those terms. And then all of a sudden, you've got these three guys, and this is the stuff they're mostly talking about. They weren't talking about the craft. They weren't talking about how to perfect a scene. They were, they were talking about how to get the work out there, and that was fascinating to me too. So, those guys kind of a debt. Mm-hmm. So, all right. So, you've got, how many books are in the Arts Reborn series right now?
So far, there's 2 books that are published as ebooks. One, I have to really get through the print proof. Yeah. So the second book's up there as well. I've got a tie-in short story published. Well, not published, but available free on my website. So yeah, published, but not available at retailers. I have a novella that happens after the second book, and that was an interesting one where I had an idea of what I was going to do with the third book, but I'd started writing it and it wasn't coming together the way I wanted with the plot, and I just felt like I needed to tell this, or it would be useful to know this other thing, but just with the timelines, this one sort of area of things happening wasn't going to fit with the way that the rest of the book was going to flow, how it was starting to really come together. Yeah. And so I took an aside and started writing this novella. So that's, about 40,000 word novella, single character for one of the minor characters in one place. And so I've got that written. I've got to edit that. And right now I'm plotting out the third. I'm going to start for NaNoWriMo this year, because I've done part of each of the 3 books so far in NaNoWriMo. So this one I want to do a substantial part of it. So this will be the third, and I know where the 4th and the 5th books are going to go. So it's 5 books in this series, but I could absolutely write more in the world subsequent to that. And I have some ideas for some other short story tie-ins or different things like that as well that I want to explore.
So do you write every day?
Not every day as much as I would like. When I am writing, it's a lot better that way. And if I don't, it's harder to get going that next day again. Yeah. So I absolutely want to. What I've been doing leading up to this is I've actually been doing, I've got different writing exercises that I've collected from different places. So if I'm not writing something new for my book, I'm going to at least do a writing exercise to just keep, it's like staying in shape. It's like, if you're going to be, instead of trying to, I was explaining this to my wife the other day, where it's almost like if you're a long distance runner, which I'm absolutely not, and I really don't like long distance running, but writing a book's a marathon. Look, it absolutely is a marathon. And if you think, okay, I'm going to finish that marathon and now I'm going to go write another one, maybe you can, and some people can, but some people need a little bit of a break. But if you're not at least going jogging or something in between, then it gets really painful and slow, and you're never going to be nowhere near your time. So this is my idea now, is at all times to at least have these writing exercises on the go. So I've got new words of something or something related to it, flowing every single day. And I really feel good where I'm at. The plot for the third one is really, really cool and a lot multi-dimensional, and it's going to be a lot of fun to write. So what is actually your process then in developing a book? Like, where do you start? And that's evolving each time. It's really neat. So the first one, I went in with a couple of ideas and a general idea of where it was what the climax would be like, but I was mainly pantsing it. And I did change direction, actually. I pivoted a little bit in terms of what some of the initial words from like a couple of years before that I'd written in Brush with Darkness, and then things really came together later. So I went back and sort of started again. And I didn't have to. It's funny. It was eerie how little I had to change. It was almost like I was writing this other story before I even knew that I was going anywhere near there. But then it really came out and sort of tightened up later. About halfway through, I think I read a couple of books related to plotting. Save the Cat, the screenwriting plotting, like sort of plot system one. That really helped. Using that let me put up a couple of flags that along the way, and it fit nicely with where I was going, but it helped me to solidify that slightly, and that helped me to finish that first book. So I took that and a couple of things borrowed from, I think it was from Larry Brooks' Story Engineering, to play with. And I just read it, like that was the first time I'd really adventured into plotting. So I was like, okay, so for the second book, I'm going to try on that plotting hat and see how it fits. Because, I know some people swear by it. Some people are like, no, I'm a pantser. No, I'm never going to be a plotter. But I'm like, well, I'm going to try just to see. So I did, and plotted more of that, and that worked out pretty well. But I still don't. I found myself struggling to, because I know like the SPP guys, they write the beats that Sean writes are great, and I was really impressed with how he did that. And I couldn't get down to that level, sitting at a computer in advance. But then what I started to do was, when I was starting to plot out the third book, was go away from the computer and voice record myself, just brainstorming out loud on different things, and in my notebook writing out different plot ideas and different things to pull together. And so that's how for the second one. So I'd sort of have like a sentence of, I know what this scene is going to be about, but not 2 or 3 and not to that much detail. And so that was, sometimes it worked great. My best thing for that is I need to have at least that sentence like by the night before, so I know what I'm going to write the next day. If I don't, then I'm going to be way less efficient. But this third book, I've just read another book, and I'm actually going through the process, or 2, because there was a story bundle that just came out for NaNoWriMo. And so it's David Farland's $1 Million Outlines is one that I'm going to use part of his outline process to just try it on again. And there was another book called 21 Days to a Novel, Michael Stackpole, I think the name is. And his one I've been going through over the last week, doing several days a day of his 21-day system. But it's a series of writing exercises that build up towards the plotting, and then it's a pretty short book, and so that one's neat. So I'm trying that out, and I like that. And it's the neat thing about that is it's gotten me writing much more like Sean's beats to his exercises. So that's been sort of a bit of a revelation, and I'm finding it so much fun and so creative, this side of it, compared to, I know a lot of pantsers think, no, I can't do plotting because it'll steal all the creative side of it. But I don't know, I think this has been a ton of fun. So it's evolving every time I refine it a little bit, see what I can do. But I'm very open-minded that way, and I by no means think I've got it figured out completely yet, but I'm having a blast while doing it.
Well, that's how you build a business anyway, right?
Exactly.
You try something, and you see what result you get, and you try something else. So I think you're on the right track. I'm going to actually have to check that book out, because that's one I haven't read yet. So in terms of story in your life, I mean, where does your writing fit in? Like what percentage would you say, novel writing is to your everyday life now?
I'm absolutely spending time every day on writing related activities. My consulting is very part-time, and it's very, very flexible when I am doing it. So, if I have a deadline, I might do a full day's work on the consulting, but most of the time I'm just doing a few hours here and a few hours there, often while watching television and enjoying stories. So it's a neat kind of work where I can enjoy doing something else or listening to podcasts or that sort of thing while I do it. So that I love that double use time in a way that's not, multitasking in a bad way. It's multitasking in a useful way. So I definitely spend time writing and or editing every day. I definitely spend time reading every day. I've ramped up my reading more recently, especially with being a part of the podcast, the To Be Read podcast on that side as well. But I never spend like a full day doing writing activities, although some come close. I was doing some editing yesterday that took quite a while, as well as doing some of my plotting stuff. So I might have put in a full day's work on it. That's like yesterday. The other side is I have 2 young kids at home, and spend a lot of time with them, and do a lot of things with them. So I'm sort of bouncing around all over the place, and I'm the furthest thing from a structured, rigid schedule kind of person. So, and our life's kind of like that. So I always want to be doing more, but I know I'll have more time as the kids get older too, and so I don't feel guilty about sort of any of it.
So what's the end game here? What do you what's your goal for the writing part of your life?
My goal is to continue writing for the rest of my life and publishing along the way. I have so many ideas. I never want to stop. I'm not looking towards. It's funny because I've had various types of businesses, and I've gone through the situation of setting up a business that then replaced my work income, so I was able to leave my job, and so I've been there, done that, and seen how that works, and then seen that morph into something that takes over your life in a way that isn't necessarily the way that you wanted it to fit, and ended up selling that business, and then working with other things. So I don't mind doing the consulting work that I do. So I'm not trying to get rid of it, and so I intend to keep a little bit of that and sort of engaging that part of my analytical mind. And because it's so flexible, so I can do that indefinitely. I would like to see the writing income continue to grow over time so that I have complete flexibility on that side and maybe could say no to a few more projects. But I'm not, I never want to stress my writing with having to be the only thing that's generating income in our lives either, because I know it'll stress my wife out more than me, and when I know she's stressed, then that creeps over to me a little bit, and I think will cramp my creativity. So just the balance. So this isn't my like golden ticket, get rich quick by any stretch. I absolutely want to be publishing multiple works every year for the rest of my life, and I just think that's going to be a blast to do that. And I've got ideas for collaborating with my wife in the future on some, and it would be so cool if down the road my kids want to collaborate on things. No pressure, but I just absolutely see the opportunity for that to happen too. So,
are you like watching their grades in English class now? Like,
well, they're young. My boys are like 3 and 5.
Okay.
And we homeschool too, so we'll have a lot more time together for doing things. So yeah. It's right now. I'm just sharing stories with them, reading to them, reading out loud. I love reading out loud too, so that's another,
So how do you figure? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say. So like my older son is starting to read a little bit now, but he still loves me reading to him. So I'm like, it's very clear. Hey, I will never say no to reading to you. Like I'm not going to be one of those parents that's like, well, you can read now, go read it yourself. I'm like, no, I want to be there with you until you say no. I'm just going to do this myself, and I'll be fine with that too.
Yeah, you're nurturing a love of story for them as well. Then
absolutely.
So that's an interesting idea too. I mean, it's an interesting conversation because it's generational at that point. Do you see any difference in your relationship with your kids? I mean, you don't really have a comparison to not reading to them, but maybe since you started writing.
It's like I said, it's sort of circular there because reading to my son helped me to get back into wanting to tell stories again, which helped me to start writing more, more consistently. So it just totally naturally fit together there. It's funny. I wonder if my mother had access to the things that we do now, she may have written back, because she's been a huge reader all her life, and constantly has books out of the library to this day. And she's got ideas, but she's still, I don't know, if she'd been able to work on the technology side when she was younger, she might be more comfortable with it. It's too bad. But I know she definitely passed on that love of reading, and she read out loud to us as long as we wanted her to. And I don't know, I always claim that I started reading myself a little quicker just because my younger sister was born, and maybe I couldn't always get her to read when she wanted to, or read to me when I wanted her to, now that my little sister was taking her time too. Right. So I was like, fine, I'm going to go off and do it myself. So.
Yeah, I had that experience, I think. So reading obviously plays a huge role in every writer's life. I think there's that line from Stephen King that, good writers are good readers. Mm-hmm. And clearly you subscribe to that model. right?
Absolutely. No.
No, I don't. Yeah, burn all the books. So, who are some of the influences though that you've had? Like, who's someone you read regularly that had a huge influence on your work?
Huh. It's funny. I was about to talk, and then you cut me up with the read regularly, because I don't read anyone regularly. Like
Yeah,
I don't have. I've never. Not since I was. I guess I don't know. I used to delve deep. Now I
yeah,
go more broad in my reading.
yeah,
Like I remember back in high school, like I'd be reading Dragonlance books, and now I'm going to read every single thing that Weiss and Hickman have written, and and then I read David Eddings. I read the Belgariad or Belgariad, and then I read every single book in that series, and whether Piers Anthony or someone else, or
yeah,
all those things. Or then I got into James Clavell and historical fiction, or got into Colleen McCullough's books, like I mentioned. Um, so I used to do that. I think the last author that I really went that deep with that way was Terry Goodkind with his sort of Truth series,
hmm
which is a funny one because I hear some published writers making fun of it in some ways. Never the first book. The first book's great, but sort of where he went with the series from there, and then where some of his political view, or sort of economic or sort of Ayn Randish views sort of filter into some of his stuff. But I don't know. That was one that I did follow for quite a while, but now it's interesting. He's changed his style, and it's now being a writer. Think like seeing those things and seeing sort of, oh, okay, I see what you did there. Or I see where you decided to play with your political ideas in that particular book that some
yeah,
people hated, but I thought was cool. And now you're trying more thriller type pacing and sort of just the way that some of the things cut off. So I don't love it, and I don't. So I'm never that rabid fan that's reading every single book by that
yeah,
person. Um, but from the influences perspective, I already mentioned the Colleen McCullough side or
yeah,
James Clavell side, or when I was young, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and then getting into all the other types of books, fantasy books. The It's funny, one of the ones that's a modern day influence on so many people that I've watched some great panels talking about it is obviously George R. R. Martin and Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones series. I didn't start reading it until much later, and I haven't watched the show yet because I want to read the whole series. I want to read more of the series before I start watching the show as well.
yeah,
Um, but I saw some neat things in what he was doing, and I know they are influencing me in some ways. Guy Gabriel Kay is an author I always talk about, that influenced me, absolutely not in terms of style, but in terms of what he does with his blend of historically inspired fantasy, where he'll write about the Byzantine Empire or write about Renaissance Italy, but instead of saying this is set in Venice or this little duchy or whatever, he'll make up his own world based on that and the themes that are going on and everything that's happening, events that are happening. But he doesn't want to have to be true to history. And he had a quote, I always misquote it, but it basically, I don't want to be the one putting words into these real people's mouths. So in honoring the past, he'd rather take the ideas and take ideas of this character and then work them through his own situations in his own alternate sort of world, rather than try and base it in actual historical fiction. But it's really neat stuff, and I loved his China stuff, and Tigana's is one that's written in Italy, and I haven't read the Byzantine one, but I've heard the rest of it's very good. And the fact that he's also a Canadian author and came from a neat background where he got to help Christopher Tolkien with the editing of Unfinished Tales, Silmarillion,
yeah,
was in his early days. Is really neat. So that was one. And then another Canadian author that right as I was just starting to write again, that didn't influence me but sort of inspired me in certain ways, is R. Scott Bakker, who would be lesser known, but his Prince of Nothing series. So the first book is The Darkness That Comes Before. And he's really into a lot of neuroscience, where neuroscience touches philosophy and theory of mind and things like that. And he writes fantasy where he's exploring some of that stuff and nature of belief and a whole bunch of things. And it's funny. It's darker and it's a little bit, there's gritty aspects of it, which I don't love that side, but it was interesting. And he's got this just generations of history and culture all going on, and he's written so much and it's so epic on that side, but also with these really neat ideas. So that was just seeing what he did as a modern writer in some of those Tolkien-ish things, but then with all this philosophical bent was really neat. And so that was that is one where I would really like to read his next book when it comes out, which is taking him a long time and keeps getting delayed. So it's the third book of his second series, so second trilogy. The Unholy Consult is the book. I think it's supposed to now come out in 2015. So
I have to check that out too.
Yeah.
So what sort of do you explore any like allegorical themes in your work at all?
I'm just not wired that way. If it comes out by accident, sure. I'm far more likely to explore economic or political things. Like often I get inspired on that side of exploring what that might be like in some fantasy world, or how magic might influence those things. Like I love books like Why Nations Fail, or that's looking at structure, power structures in history and how they influenced why nations did well or why they didn't. So I love to explore some of those things in the background. That's a lot in my head. Like I'm writing down all these world details and playing with stuff, but it's at the end, once I sit down to write, it's all about my characters and where they're going. So it's because I'm driving mostly with just hanging on the characters' coattails and seeing where they want to go. That's where I am when I'm writing. So if anything, if some of the other stuff comes out, it's my subconscious getting involved and bringing things into play, and then if I notice those as I go along, I might massage things a little bit as I'm revising, editing. But for the most part, I'm not going from that bent and that sort of intentional direction for my writing.
So where are you taking? I mean, you've mentioned a few things, but where you take a lot of your, clearly you take a lot of inspiration from history and from, these books that talk about the rise and fall of nations and talk about the empires and the republics, excuse me. So where else are you getting sort of the grist for the mill? Where do you find inspiration for some of your stories?
It's a good question. Because I don't seek it out per se. I just and it's funny because I've been writing in one series right now. I haven't been looking sort of for that outside inspiration. I just make sure that I'm consuming stories in all different forms at all times, and just letting that play around in my head without, rarely sort of intentionally even looking at it. It's not like I go, "Oh, that was neat in that movie. I want to do that." It just all mixes together in a pot. And it's so funny. I always hear people saying, and again, everyone's got their own system. Everyone's got their own way of doing it. But I know some people say, "Oh, while I'm writing a new book, I cannot read anyone else's writing." And okay, sure, if that's for you. That seems so wrong to me. But in terms of my own process, like I need to be reading constantly. One of the almost jokes that I have, and it's funny, it's something I learned from Tim Ferriss when I was just looking into business stuff, is he reads fiction before bed,
right?
So he can stop thinking about all the business ideas he has. And that's when I got back into fiction reading. Actually, was the same thing when I was launching businesses, and I had to-do lists a mile long, and my brain just wouldn't shut up unless I get involved in someone else's story, and that would let me do that. So now, as well as having sort of the writer marketing side things that I need to get out of my head every night, it's if I'm reading someone else's story, then it stops my story from keeping me awake at night. So I'm constantly reading at least one book. I'm watching TV with my kids. I'm watching movies, and all of that's feeding together. And I try and read. I think that's another reason why I'm not sequentially reading books by people these days, because that might be the only time where they would have more of an influence on me. Whereas if I feel like the faster I can consume more different styles and different types of stories, the more that'll just mix together in a way that won't be recognizable as being anyone, but it'll just come out as me in my own way. So, and I love sort of some of the Austin Kleon stuff that I haven't read his books, but just reading some of his blogs and hearing him talk about it, the Steal Like an Artist stuff. The more inspiration you expose yourself to, the I think the more interesting things can get. So.
Is there a voice that you think is most like yours? Maybe when you imitated when you started.
I was no, I really don't. I've never looked at an author's style and said, I want to write like that.
Yeah.
That just didn't, that I know some people will do that and try and mimic it, or if anything I might do, I haven't done it, but I've read of like writing exercises where it's like, okay, go read someone with a very strong style and try and write like that for a bit, just to, again, try on that hat. I'd say the only one that sort of influenced me that way in an interesting way was after I read On Writing, and because I never liked horror, and I used to be freaked out by even the covers of Stephen King books as a kid, and I don't even want to talk about it. The TV miniseries, whatever movie of that, that was freaky. I think it, there should be psychiatrist bills probably coming out of his royalties for that one. But from reading On Writing, I realized that The Stand isn't really horror so much as it's just a post-apocalyptic. There's eerie stuff going on in it, but it's like a big good versus evil story. So it's like, wow, okay, I'm gonna go read that, and loved it. And I read the super duper extended remix version, or original mix version, that he published more recently, or released the back content for more recently, and loved it. And also went and read some of the Dark Tower books, and I was so impressed with how efficient he was with his words, really. Like, he's not, he's pretty sparse overall, right? But still evocative and still really interesting. And, there's a lot of fantasy authors who grew up on Tolkien and go to town writing tons of description, and, it can bog down. And I always just read it and I didn't have a problem with it. But my wife's brother actually said, oh yeah, even on like the Terry Goodkind stuff, he would read it, and if he sees a paragraph longer than a certain length, he'll read like the first few words and the last few words and skip it. He's like, that's just going to be description. I don't care. I'm just going to skip it. I'm like, really? People do that? Like that? It sort of opened my eyes to that. But then seeing how someone like King did it more efficiently like that, I'm certainly not like that per se, but that just got me thinking, okay, how can I keep it going forward just a little bit more, and not, so my internal sort of it's like I have a meter in my head. It's like, if I go too far with this, I gotta get out of it now. Someone needs to say something, or something needs to happen. And so, which is absolutely a good thing.
Oh yeah, that's good.
And it's funny, I actually just spent, I don't endorse this, and I don't do this in general, but the one thing that I knew I didn't like and didn't know how to do the way that I would like to, in my first book, was the second part of the first chapter. It wasn't horrible info dumping, but it was not where I would like it to be. But I knew there was a bunch of information that if you don't get grounded there, things are going to start moving. So I'm not going to be able to let it out in little pieces in a way that's going to make sense. Yeah. So I actually spent some time the past couple of days, based on just a couple of, because again, I've had it out since March, so what, 7 months now? Mm-hmm. So I went back and I actually took a new, like, fresh pair of eyes and tried to hack that down a little bit and see what I could do with it, and drove myself nuts for a bit, but now I think I've got it where I like it. So, and there's no new content per se, but it's just sort of moving around some of the paragraphs and cutting myself off from these details that it's okay for me to know, but the audience doesn't really need to know at all.
Right, yeah.
And that sort of stuff. So it's just, and my wife, when she reread that, she's like, you've grown so much in even the last year. It's just, and this is only a year, right?
Yeah.
Like how much, and I just get excited about that. Like I've always been into sort of continuous development, whether it was in the IT world or whether it's in, the business world. I love to learn. I'm never going to stop. So just the fact that this can be the kind of thing, like writing, can be the kind of thing that you're continually learning and exploring and developing and growing for your whole life, and and you don't have to stop because you're old. Like that's just really exciting to me. So
yeah, no, I always joke that I'm gonna keep writing books until I have to peck them out a letter at a time with pencils taped to my palsied monkey fingers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, well, okay, so we're up against my typical 40-minute mark, and it's been a great conversation. And I actually picked up a few things. I'm going to have to go check out a couple of books you mentioned, because there's some things I'm very interested in, not just nonfiction. A couple of fiction authors. I'm going to have to re-listen to the whole podcast and write everything down. So at any rate, I wanted to let people know that if they can find out more about you, they can check you out at jamiemaltman.com, right?
That's right.
And if you go there, be sure to sign up on. I'm sure you have a mailing list. You've got a mailing list.
Yep, yeah. I do.
So make sure you sign up for that, and
And there's even a free, actually, that short story I mentioned, the free short story that comes before the series is on my website.
Is
there.
that the Alicia?
Alicia, yeah. That's right.
Which looks very Celtic. I don't know if you mean it to look that way, but when I'm looking at it on your site,
not at all. But that's okay. I just wanted a different color.
Yeah. I like how you're doing your banners. Although it disappears. I think you got a broken. No,
it's just it's like a flash and then it disappears.
I see.
So it's just when you first get there.
It's very attention getting.
Yeah.
So, good marketing. Okay, so that is Jamie Maltman, and thanks a lot, man, for hanging out with me for the past 45 minutes or so. And you should definitely check out Arts Reborn. I enjoyed Brush with Darkness quite a bit. It's and everyone always says this kind of stuff, and I don't know why. But it's not the sort of thing I normally read. I don't know why I say that, though, because I've read plenty of books like that. In fact, it reminded me of something I had read before. But it's a fascinating book. Check it out, especially if you are into fantasy. Did we land on what kind of fantasy we're calling it? Did we ever land on anything?
I call it, it's funny, because it's historical fantasy to some people is... You're in a specific historical period, but now you got a fantasy to it. So I call it historically inspired fantasy.
There you go.
I'm borrowing from those elements, and that's what I was able to do. If I could just mention one quick thing was something else that's coming out very soon is the Beyond the Gate, which is an anthology that I've got a story in, and I've been involved in sort of coordinating that too. And that's in the world of the Dream Engine by the self-publishing podcast guys Sean Platt and Johnny B. Truitt. So this November, actually, it's depending on what the exact air date is, November 11th it should be out, and I took my own sort of historical riff on their idea, set it in China 1,000 years ago, and that's what I played with there. So it's a lot of great stories by 23, 24 different authors.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of fun.
I'm still kicking myself that I did not participate in that.
I'm still kicking you too. So.
Yeah. Next round. Yeah. I got to catch up on all the world docs and everything, and now they're about to do 1.5, and then they'll go to FU2 apparently is what we're calling it. So there's going to be a ton of stuff. I'm just going to be so far behind. But at any rate, check out Jamie Maltman at jamiemaltman.com, where you can sign up for his newsletter, check out his latest, the short story, Alicia, and be sure to check him out in November as the Beyond the Gate anthology is released, something this Wordslinger didn't get to play around in. But thanks a lot for being on the show with me, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, take care, and we will see you next week. Well, that was Jamie Maltman, and it was a pleasure to have him on the show. He and I have chatted quite a bit back and forth. I say quite a bit. We've chatted a handful of times. We should chat more. And now we're kind of we're doing a little bit of collaborating together, working together, helping each other out as part of a group. And that's been interesting, and it's a lot of fun. And I think we're all going to get a lot out of it. I don't know if you have tuned in to the Self-Publishing Answers podcast that I do with Nick Thacker. If you haven't, go check that out. If you're an indie author, you're going to dig it, because we talk about sort of these sorts of topics, the marketing and, the nuts and bolts and ins and outs of indie publishing, and you'll get a lot out of that. But one thing that I have learned from that experience working with Nick Thacker is just how valuable it can be to collaborate with others on every aspect of this. So that's just a side note. And Jamie's a good guy, and I've liked talking to him, so I'm looking forward to doing some more stuff with him. At any rate, if you want to learn more about Jamie Maltman's work, you should check out Jamie Maltman's website at jamiemaltman.com. And I'm going to put links to that in the show notes. But you can pick up copies of his books, Brush with Darkness and Blood in the Water, and you can also pick up the short story Alicia, and you should definitely check out the Beyond the Gate anthology, which is a collection of work written by the people who participated in Fiction Unboxed, and that's going to have a special foreword written by Sean Platt, who, by the way, is going to be on next week's show. So tune in to hear that, and if you got questions, this is the time to send them. Unfortunately, the interview has already been recorded, but you can definitely send me questions and I'll pass them along. We can get them answered on the air. So if you go to kevintumlinson.com/podcast, you can leave me a voicemail. You can either just record it directly from your computer, or you can enter your phone number, and it'll call you. Google will call you, and you can leave a voicemail directly for me. That comes to my inbox. And if you don't want to do the voice thing, you can always type up a message the old-fashioned way right there in an email link that's on the page. So however you want to get it to me, and I will either play or read your question on the air and do my best to answer it. And if it's for one of my guests, you can always ask me a question meant for one of my guests. I will pass it along and get you an answer, and we'll make sure you're taken care of. So that music means it's time to wrap things up, and it's been another great week, guys. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Once again, go check me out online at kevintumlinson.com/podcast, where you can leave me a voicemail or an email. And why don't you check out some of my books while you're there? kevintumlinson.com/books is how you do that. Take care of yourselves, and we will talk to you next week.
Word Slinger.